My mother's death unlocked a lie that split my family in half and sent my own brother to federal prison. She bequeathed me a $190,000 collection of rare first-edition children's books, but my brother, the executor, forged a codicil that gave every volume to his daughter and told me I'd been cut out. A single locked tin box my mother had hidden for decades, a fake signature I learned to detect, and his own greed ultimately put him behind bars. Today I run a children's literacy nonprofit called Turned Pages, where kids earn those exact books by reading, and I trademarked a logo with his name crossed out beneath the words Dishonest Executor. I was 47 years old when my mother collapsed in her kitchen, dead of a massive aneurysm before she hit the tile. For the previous 2 years I had been the one driving 4 hours every Saturday to check on her, filling her pillbox, reading aloud from the well-worn pages of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, a first edition she'd inherited from her grandmother, and which I'd treasured ever since I was small. My brother Mark, a corporate mergers attorney with a corner office in a downtown high-rise, had visited twice in that same span, and both times he spent the whole afternoon on his phone. I was a 4th-grade teacher with a modest salary and zero head for estate law, and I had spent every spare cent I made keeping that house running while he billed $600 an hour. I did not resent it back then. That is simply how it was. The quiet architect of our family dynamic was not my mother or even my brother. It was the decades-long habit of me being the caretaker and Mark being the taker, a pattern so old it felt like weather. Mark and his wife Tiffany arrived 18 hours after Mom's body was taken to the mortuary. They pulled up in a newly detailed pearl-white Escalade, Tiffany's heels clicking across the driveway like a metronome of doom before I'd even finished sorting the sympathy casseroles. She wore a designer pantsuit and carried a leather folio, and within minutes she was cataloguing furniture and asking about appraisals. Mark stood in the living room, scanning the bookshelves with a faint smile I could not read. He hugged me stiffly, said he was here to help manage the nightmare, and within 2 sentences, he had already turned the conversation to probate and asset distribution. I was still wearing the same sweater I'd had on when I found her, still smelling the faint coffee and dust of her kitchen. The following morning, while Mark was on a conference call in his car and Tiffany was photographing the china cabinet with the detached efficiency of an insurance adjuster, I set about cleaning out my mother's bedroom closet. That was when I found the tin. It was a small, rust-speckled file box, maybe 8 inches by 6, with a simple 3-digit combination lock built into the clasp. It was hidden beneath a stack of old sewing patterns, McCall's from the 1970s, patterns my mother had kept but never used, as if she'd planned to teach me to sew and never found the time. The tin was heavier than it looked. I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table. Mark came inside from his call, saw the box and flicked a dismissive hand. Junk, toss it. We have to focus on the estate filing. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through a to-do list, then walked away without another glance, already talking to Tiffany about the deadline for the probate inventory. I tucked the tin into my tote bag, beneath a folded sweater, and took it back to my apartment that night. There was something about the weight, the way the lock resisted a casual rattle, that told me it was not junk at all. At 2 a.m, sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor with the tin in my lap, I worked the combination. It took me 40 minutes of trial and error, because my father had been a locksmith, and he'd taught me to feel the gate inside a lock. A combination lock like this has a wheel pack, and if you apply light tension on the shackle, you can feel the slight click as each wheel's gate aligns with the locking bar. My father had shown me when I was 12, his big hands guiding my small ones on a practice lock he had made from spare parts. He said I had a fine touch, better than his, because my teacher's fingers were sensitive from grading papers and threading needles. That night the old knowledge came back. I turned the dial slowly, feeling for the faint resistance shift, noting the numbers where the click deepened. The final combination was 7-14-29, my parents' anniversary. When the hasp popped open, the hinges creaked, and inside I found a single sheet of heavy cotton paper, folded twice, and a small brass key tied to a white cotton tag. The tag read in my mother's careful block letters, First Pioneer Trust, Box 7. The note was in her handwriting, blue fountain pen, careful loops I'd seen her form 1,000 times on birthday cards and grocery lists. It read, My dearest girl, if you're reading this, I am gone. Do not trust your brother, he will try to take the books. He would sell them piece by piece and leave you with nothing. I have taken precautions, but you must be the one to guard them. The key opens compartment 7 at First Pioneer Trust. Be careful, save yourself. Underneath she had drawn a small book with a heart on its cover. My hand shook so badly I had to set the note down. She had known, and still she'd never told me outright, probably to protect me from the confrontation she feared I wasn't ready for. The books she meant were the collection that had lived in the built-in glass-doored bookcase in her hallway since before I was born. Rare first editions of children's literature, accumulated by my grandmother and added to by my mother over 60 years. The signed first edition Wizard of Oz was the crown jewel, but there was also an 1865 Alice's Adventures in Wonderland with the original tissue guard over the frontispiece, an early print of the Tale of Peter Rabbit with its little square format and illustrated end papers, a first edition Charlotte's Web with the original dust jacket unclipped, and 37 other volumes that a dealer once casually valued at around $190,000. They were not just money. They were my childhood, my classroom read-alouds, the reason I became a teacher. I had spent hundreds of hours in that hallway, tracing the illustrations with my finger, learning to read from those pages, and later, as a teacher, bringing my students to see them as a special treat, watching their eyes go wide at the idea that a book could be over 100 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth, no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it, will always find a way to the surface. The next day, Mark and Tiffany sat me down in my mother's living room with a folder full of papers. The funeral hadn't even happened yet. My mother's body was still at the mortuary awaiting arrangements, and they were already pushing documents. Mark's demeanor had shifted into smooth, practiced attorney mode. He explained that Mom had updated her will 6 months before her death, and he as executor had located the latest version. The original will, he said, divided everything equally, but the new codicil, signed and notarized, specifically revoked my inheritance of the book collection and designated his daughter Emily as the sole beneficiary. He slid a copy across the coffee table. I saw my mother's signature, a loopy Elena Vance, alongside a notary stamp dated February 14th of that year. The notary's name, printed below the stamp, was Candace Durling with a commission number. He told me Mom had felt I was too emotionally attached to the books to manage them properly and wanted them to stay in the family with the next generation, meaning his child. Tiffany patted my hand and said, "We want to take care of you, honey. Why don't you sign over the house to Mark so we can handle the liquidation? You'll get your share from the proceeds later, and you can come stay with us while you grieve." The trap was baited with the softest words. I knew in my bones the codicil was fake. My mother and I had talked about the collection just 3 weeks before she died. She had pulled me into the hallway, touched the spine of the Oz book and said, "This belongs to you for all those children you'll inspire. Never let it be sold." Her voice had been steady, her eyes clear, even though her body was failing. February 14th was 2 months after a massive stroke had left her with severe aphasia and a tremor so bad she could barely hold a fork. I had watched her try to sign a birthday card for her neighbor in March, and the signature was a jagged, halting line that barely resembled her name. The signature on that document was fluid and steady, the loop of the E perfectly formed, the slant exactly the same as her healthy handwriting from years before. But I did not say any of that. Instead, I looked at Mark with the glassy eyes of an exhausted, broken woman. I let my shoulders slump. I said I could not think about legal documents right now, that I needed time to process, and I agreed to move into their guest room for a few weeks to rest. He patted my shoulder with the same remote efficiency he used on junior associates. I felt his hand like a cold weight, and behind my downcast eyes, I was already cataloguing the notary's name, the date, the inconsistencies. Their house was a 5-bedroom Tudor on a manicured cul-de-sac, filled with furniture that still had tags on the upholstery and a kitchen island the size of a small car. Everything was beige and cream, like a model home designed to look soothing but feeling sterile. The guest room had a cheerful floral comforter and a deadbolt on the outside of the door, though I did not notice the deadbolt until the second night, when I tried to go to the bathroom and found the door wouldn't budge. Tiffany installed a room monitor for my safety, a little white camera angled toward the bed, its red indicator light blinking in the darkness. She made a show of helping me set my phone on a charger in the kitchen each evening to limit my stress, and she checked my bag before we left the house, claiming she was just organizing. I was, in every sense, a prisoner wrapped in guest room linens, and the softness of it made the cage harder to see from the outside. I played the part they had written for me. I shuffled around in slippers, spoke in vague, foggy sentences, and let Tiffany bring me weak tea while I stared out the window as if I could barely recall my own name. I mentioned headaches, confusion, the fog of grief. I asked the same questions twice, let my voice tremble. Underneath the performance, I was cataloging everything. I noticed that Mark took his calls in the basement, not his home office, lowering his voice and pacing in the shadows among the water heater and storage bins. I noticed that Tiffany, who had never held a job in the decade I'd known her, was suddenly ordering custom window treatments and scheduling landscape architects, and she kept a spreadsheet on her laptop that I caught a glimpse of when she opened it on the kitchen island. The spreadsheet had a column labeled Liquidation Timeline, with entries like R's signed copy dealer JR, offered 82K, Alice private collector 45K, Charlotte pending auction. They were already pricing out my mother's soul, assigning dollar amounts to the books that had shaped my entire life, as casually as I'd price ground beef at the grocery store. I took notes in a small pocket journal I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out section of a paperback I had brought from home, a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo I had read to my fourth graders. I'd carved out the center pages with a craft knife, leaving a rectangular compartment just large enough for the journal and a pen. It seemed fitting, the story of a man unjustly imprisoned, meticulously plotting his revenge over years, learning everything he needed to know while his enemies thought him broken. Whenever I was alone in the guest room with the door deadbolted from the outside, I would take it out and write down dates, overheard snippets, numbers, names. I also began to test the edges of my cage. How long did it take Tiffany to check on me when I was quiet? How loudly did I need to cough to bring her to the door? I learned their rhythms. Mark left for the office at 7:40, Tiffany did a Pilates video in the living room at 9, and there was a half-hour window mid-morning when the house cleaners came and everyone was distracted. I was a lamb, but I was sharpening my teeth. 2 weeks in, I orchestrated my first real reconnaissance. I had already mapped the house's layout in my mind. Mark's home office was on the first floor, next to the powder room. I spilled a mug of tea across the hallway floor, deliberately, a full 12-ounce cascade of milky brown liquid that puddled on the hardwood and seeped toward the baseboard. Tiffany sighed, exasperated, and went to fetch a mop from the laundry room, grumbling about another mess. I slipped into Mark's office. The desk was a chaotic sprawl of paperwork, most of it related to estate filings, tax documents, and a thick accordion folder labeled E. Vance probate. I had maybe 90 seconds before she returned, so I focused on the filing cabinet beside the desk. It was a standard 2-drawer steel HON unit with a single key lock. Locked. I memorized the brand, the approximate age, the type of lock face. I slipped out just as I heard her footsteps returning, and when she came back with the mop, I was standing there looking helpless, apologizing for my clumsiness. That night, I retrieved the small leather pouch from my tote bag. It held a set of tension wrenches and a hook pick I had kept since my father's shop closed. He had run a small locksmith business out of a storefront on Oak Street, and as a teenager I'd worked summers there, cutting keys, rekeying locks, and occasionally helping him open cars when people locked their keys inside. He taught me that most locks are just puzzles, and every puzzle has a solution if you have patience and a steady hand. I had not used the tools in 20 years, but the muscle memory was there. I waited until the house fell quiet, until I heard the distant hum of Mark's CPAP machine through the walls and the settling of the foundation. Then I eased out of bed. The camera's power cable ran behind the dresser. I had noticed it the first night, and I gently unplugged it from the wall, careful not to disconnect the adapter from the cable itself, so it would look like a power outage if they checked. In the dark, I crept downstairs. The lock on that filing cabinet was a wafer tumbler, a common type found in low-security office furniture. It offered about as much resistance as a child's diary lock. I inserted my tension wrench into the keyway, applied a light rotational pressure, and used the hook pick to feel for the wafers one by one. The first wafer clicked into place, then the second, then the third. It took me less than a minute to rake the lock open, and the drawer slid out with a soft metallic sigh. Inside, I found the originals of the forged codicil, the notary journal entry, and a stack of emails printed on heavy office paper. The originals were in a manila folder labeled Codicil Original, as if Mark was so arrogant he didn't bother to hide them. The codicil itself was a 2-page document on cream-colored legal paper, with a notary block at the bottom. The signature, purposed to be my mother's, was crisp, dark, and slanted at the exact angle her healthy hand always used. But my father, the locksmith, had also been an amateur document examiner for the county court, a side gig he'd picked up because he understood the mechanics of how things were made and how they could be faked. He had taught me the basics of ink analysis using a loupe and a flashlight. I tilted the page under my pocket flashlight and saw that the pen strokes laid on top of the paper fibers, without any of the slight feathering you see when an older person's unsteady hand presses down. The ink sat on the surface like a coating, not a marination. Moreover, the date of notarization, February 14, happened to fall on a Saturday that year, and I knew from my mother's calendar, which I had kept for her, that her regular notary did not work weekends. A different stamp had been used, one registered to Candice Durling. I committed that name to memory. The notary journal entry was even more damning. It recorded a personal appearance by my mother at a shipping store 20 miles from the nursing home where she lived, on a day when her medical records showed she was bedbound with a severe hematoma. The facility's logbook, which I would later obtain, showed no visitors, no outings. My mother had not left that building in 2 months. The entry described her as alert and of sound mind, which was a cruel joke, because that week she had been unable to recognize her own reflection in a mirror. The notary, Candice Durling, had signed off with her stamp and commission number, and a quick mental note told me I needed to find out who she was. The emails were a chain between Mark and a rare book dealer named Joseph Ralston, dating back to 4 weeks before our mother died. Mark wrote, "I'll have possession of a signed first edition Oz within the quarter. Condition VG, dust jacket intact, can you authenticate? Looking for a clean sale, no public listing." Ralston's reply, "Can do 78, maybe 85. Send scans when ready." There were subsequent messages discussing shipping, insurance, and the phrase offshore escrow. Mark was planning to sell the most valuable volume before probate even closed, and the money would vanish into an account in the Cayman Islands. I found a wire transfer slip marked Evercrest Holdings, a company Tiffany had incorporated in Delaware the same month my mother died, with a registered agent address that was just a P.O. box. He had also taken out a home equity line of credit on our mother's house, forging her endorsement on the application. I found the loan statement in the same drawer. The total debt exceeded the home's listing value, and the paperwork listed me as a co-signer, though my signature was a clumsy counterfeit that didn't even approximate how I write my capital A. I stared at that fake signature for a long moment. They were not just stealing the books, they were trying to saddle me with debt, to make me legally liable for their looting. I photographed everything with a burner phone I had purchased a week earlier at a gas station off the interstate. I had paid cash, activated it with a prepaid card, and hidden it inside my pillow in a small slit I had made along the seam. The images were clear, the timestamps intact. I then returned the documents precisely as I had found them, aligning the edges with the folder tabs, relocked the cabinet, and crept back to bed. I reconnected the camera cable and lay in the dark, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The next morning I added powdered creamer to my tea, while Mark complained about the delay in probate and Tiffany hinted that maybe a professional care facility might be better for me if I couldn't get my head together. I just nodded and asked for more tea, letting my voice quaver. Inside, I was building a case, brick by brick. The key from the tin box gnawed at my mind. I needed to reach First Pioneer Trust, a bank on the other side of town that I had never known my mother used. The problem was that I had no car, my phone was monitored, and any absence longer than an hour would trigger suspicion. I solved this by scheduling a fake medical appointment. I told Tiffany I had found a small lump in my breast and needed a mammogram, a thing no one questions, a thing that makes people look away and say, of course, take all the time you need. She drove me to the clinic, a large medical complex with multiple wings. I had researched the layout beforehand, using a map I'd accessed on the burner phone while napping. I checked in at the radiology desk, gave a false name, and then slipped out the back through a staff hallway that connected to the adjacent building. I wore a scarf and sunglasses, not exactly a disguise, but enough to blur me on any security camera. I caught a bus on the main road, something I hadn't done in years, and 30 minutes later I was standing in the marble lobby of First Pioneer Trust, key in hand. A trust officer named Margaret Lynn met me in a private conference room. She already knew who I was. My mother had left a file with my photo and identifying information, and the trust documents required 2-factor verification, including a passphrase my mother had chosen. Dorothy's Silver Slippers, a reference to the original book, not the movie. I spoke it with a lump in my throat. My mother had set up a revocable living trust 5 years earlier, naming herself as trustee with me as successor trustee upon her death, but she had also filed an amendment, a document she called the Book Legacy Rider, that moved the entire collection of first edition children's books into an irrevocable trust with me as sole trustee and beneficiary. The rider was airtight. The books could not be sold, transferred, or used as collateral without my personal in-person consent, witnessed by 2 trust department officers, and notarized with a specific institutional seal. The trust also contained a dead man's switch clause, a term I had only heard in computer hacking stories. If anyone filed a change of beneficiary document without the physical presence and biometric identification of the trustee, the entire trust would freeze all assets and immediately notify the bank's compliance department and the state attorney general's estate fraud unit. My mother had seen Mark's greed from a distance, in the way he'd pressured her about rationalizing assets years before, in the way he'd casually mentioned that the books were underutilized capital, while she was sitting right there. She had quietly built a fortress of legal paper around the one thing she loved most, and she had done it with such softness that he never saw the walls. Margaret Lynn sat with me and walked through every provision. She was a woman in her 50s with steel-grey hair and the calm, measured voice of someone who had seen family treachery before and no longer found it surprising. She then said my mother had left a sealed letter for me in the trust file. I opened it with trembling hands. It read in part, "I knew Mark would try this if I died suddenly. The books are yours. The trust is your shield. If he has already forged a codicil, that act itself triggers the freeze when you notify the bank. All we need is your voice. Be careful, my darling. Your father's lock picks are in the attic of the house in the blue toolbox. He always said you had the finest touch." I broke down in that conference room. Margaret Lynn brought me a box of tissues and waited without speaking. Then I gathered myself, blew my nose, and began planning the takedown with the same meticulous patience I'd once used to restore a water-damaged copy of The Wind in the Willows for my classroom library, a process that had taken 3 months of careful drying, pressing, and page repair. I told Margaret Lynn I would return within a week with an evidence packet, and we coordinated a signal. I would text her a simple phrase, "The pages are turning," and she would initiate the freeze and contact the federal agent assigned to bank fraud cases in our district. She gave me the agent's name, a man named Daniel Reyes, and I wrote it in my hidden journal. I also called a probate litigator I had found through a teacher colleague, a woman named Kendra Hale who specialized in contested wills and forgery. I had managed to make the call from a pay phone at the bus station, because pay phones still exist if you know where to look, and I fed quarters into the slot like a time traveler. Kendra Hale listened to my story with the intensity of a hawk. I gave her the photographs, and she confirmed that the codicil was prosecutable as felony forgery under state law, and that the bank trust rider made Mark's actions a federal offense because the trust was chartered across state lines and involved financial institutions. She said she would need the original documents if possible, or at least certified copies, and she began drafting a petition to probate court to invalidate the codicil and freeze the estate proceedings. She also told me to keep documenting everything, to stay safe, and to trust no one in that house. I told her I had already learned that lesson the hard way. I returned to the clinic waiting room just in time for Tiffany to pick me up. I had changed back into my clinic gown and then into my street clothes, mussed my hair, and faked a weary relief that the lump was benign. I told her the doctor had said it was just a cyst, nothing to worry about, and she gave a perfunctory, "thank goodness," while checking her phone. She was texting a contractor about marble bathroom tiles for the guest bathroom, the one next to my room, because they were planning to renovate it with a steam shower and heated floors. The cruelty of it was so casual, the way my supposed health crisis was just a blip while she spent my mother's money on tile, that I felt a cold, clarifying anger settle into my bones. But the real test was yet to come. I needed to know if there was any scrap of humanity left in my brother, and I needed it recorded for the eventual sentencing phase, because a judge and jury can understand financial fraud intellectually, but they need to see the soullessness to feel the full weight of it. 3 nights later, I staged the scare. I had planted the burner phone on a shelf in the hallway earlier, angled to capture the scene, recording audio and video. I waited until Mark and Tiffany were both in the house, then I faked a slip on the polished floor. I went down hard, sprawling with my body half in the kitchen doorway, and I made my breathing ragged, clutching my chest, letting my eyes flutter. I have never had acting training, but I had spent weeks observing grief, and I knew how to make a body look broken. Tiffany walked in, saw me on the floor, and paused. Mark came in behind her, a manila folder in his hand. He looked at me, assessed the scene, and then stepped over my body, careful to avoid scuffing his loafers on my hip. He bent down, not to check my pulse but to grab the tote bag lying beside my arm. He dumped its contents onto the counter, my wallet, some tissues, the brass key from the tin box. He held the key up to the light and said, "Finally." Tiffany asked if they should call an ambulance, and Mark said, "Give it a minute, she's probably faking. Once we get this key copied, we can access the trust box and override the freeze." I lay there, every sense sharpened, listening to the clink of the key as he pocketed it. The fact that he would let his sister lie on the floor, possibly dying, to secure a key he thought might unlock a safety deposit box told me everything. I stayed down for another 3 minutes, cataloguing their footsteps, their voices, the sound of the photocopier in his office as he duplicated the key. Then I revived, groggy and confused, apologizing for the spell. Mark's performance of concern was so wooden it could have splintered. That night, after I had reconnected the camera and they had gone to bed, I retrieved the phone and watched the footage. The image was grainy, but the audio was crystal clear. I uploaded the video to a secure cloud account through an encrypted connection, and I sent the link to Kendra Hale. The emotional dam had broken, any residual family loyalty had been scorched to ash. I was no longer a grieving daughter, I was a tactical instrument, and my brother was simply the target. The final play came a week later. Mark had grown desperate. The rare book dealer had set a firm deadline for the Oz book, and the bank had flagged the duplicate notary stamps on the codicil and requested a hearing that Mark had been dodging. He cornered me in the kitchen and said, in a tone that allowed no argument, that we needed to go to First Pioneer Trust to straighten out a paperwork glitch. He held up a document he had prepared, a trustee resignation and release of interest form, already filled out with my supposed consent, my name typed in, waiting for a signature. He claimed it was a simple signature on a release form so the trust could be reconciled with probate. I knew exactly what he intended, to get me in front of a trust officer, pressure me to sign, and liquidate the books before the authorities could catch up. I said yes calmly and dressed in my plainest cardigan, the one my mother had given me for my 39th birthday because I wanted her with me. Tiffany drove, Mark in the passenger seat holding a leather portfolio. I sat in the back with my tote bag, which contained the original tin box note, the burner phone, the small pocket journal with my notes, and a small digital voice recorder that was still running. We walked into the bank lobby at 10:15 a.m. Margaret Lynn greeted us with professional courtesy and led us into the same conference room where I had cried 2 weeks before. Mark spread a document on the table, a single page with a signature line and a small X where my name was supposed to go. He slid a pen toward me. "Just sign here, sis. This makes everything easy. You're not well and this is too much for you. Emily will take care of the books and you can rest." His voice was silky, practiced, the voice he used on juries. I looked at the pen, a heavy silver rollerball, then at Mark's face. I let the silence stretch until the air pressure seemed to change, until I could hear the faint hum of the bank's fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of a teller's keyboard. Then I said very quietly, "You cannot inherit something you never had the right to steal." I lifted my burner phone, already dialed, and said, "The pages are turning." Margaret Lynn pressed a button under the table, a silent alarm. The conference door opened and 2 federal agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division walked in, a man and a woman in dark suits, followed by Kendra Hale and a uniformed police officer who had been waiting in the bank's back office. Mark's face went the color of curdled milk. Tiffany started shrieking about lawyers and false accusations, but the lead agent, Special Agent Daniel Reyes, recited the charges in a flat professional voice. Forgery of estate documents, bank fraud, wire fraud, felony theft, elder exploitation, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He was cuffed on the spot, his hands pulled behind his back with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The agents seized his portfolio, which contained the forged codicil, the dealer correspondence, the loan documents with my faked signature, and the copied key he had made from my tin box. Tiffany was taken in for questioning and later charged as an accessory after the fact and conspiracy. She was not cuffed in the bank, but she did lose control of her bladder in the parking lot, a detail I include only because it is true, and because the image of her standing in a spreading puddle on the asphalt, her designer shoes ruined, is a memory I cherish. The collection was released to me 2 weeks later, after a forensic accountant verified every item in the trust, and the bank's compliance team unfroze the assets. The bank also seized Mark's accounts and recovered the home equity funds he had stolen, plus an additional $53,000 he had already siphoned from a joint account my mother had mistakenly left open. The trust's dead man's switch had worked exactly as my mother intended. In the subsequent criminal trial, which lasted 8 days, the video of him stepping over me while I lay on the floor was played for the jury. The courtroom went silent. I watched half the gallery turn away in disgust, and I saw one juror wipe her eyes. My testimony took 2 days, and I described every step of the investigation, every forged document, every lie. Mark's defense attorney tried to paint me as a bitter, jealous sister, but the evidence was a mountain, and the video was the peak. He was convicted on 7 federal counts and sentenced to 11 years in a medium-security federal correctional institution. He will be 62 when he is released. Tiffany received 3 years of probation, 800 hours of community service, and a fine, though she never completed the service because she fled to her parents' vacation condo in Florida and filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences that I suspect included his incarceration. The Disney-like karma was almost too on the nose, but I did not engineer it. The truth had done the work for me. I did not sell a single book. I used the inheritance my mother had always wanted me to have and founded a children's literacy nonprofit. I named it Turned Pages. We rented a small storefront with large windows, and we built a sun-filled reading room with low shelves and beanbags in bright colors. I placed the entire collection there, insured and protected behind UV-filtering glass cases with climate control, where children from under-resourced schools can come and read first editions of the books that shaped my soul. We run a program called Earn Your Pages. A child who finishes 10 books receives a high-quality reprint of one of those classics, with a bookplate inside inscribed with their name. A child who writes their own story and shares it with us earns a chance to hold the original volume under supervision for 10 minutes, with white cotton gloves if they wish. The look on a 10-year-old's face when they turn a page of 100-year-old Alice, and the tissue guard crackles under their careful fingers, is something I cannot describe without tearing up. And yes, I did trademark a logo. It is a simple design, an open book with a quill crossing its pages, and across the bottom corner in elegant script, my brother's full name crossed out with a single clean line. Beneath it in small block letters, the words Dishonest Executor. I stamp it on every thank you card we send to donors, on the book plates we paste into the reprints, on the tote bags we give to volunteers. It is a quiet reminder that some names become synonymous with what they tried to do and failed, and that the story does not end with the villain's plot. It ends with the pages turning and the reader turning them. My mother's lesson was never about the money. It was about knowing the people you love enough to protect them from themselves, and about building a wall of integrity so sturdy that even a lawyer's forgeries cannot breach it. She had been a quiet woman, a woman who mended things rather than replaced them, who saved patterns she never used, who left a key and a note in a rusted tin box because she knew her son's heart better than he did. I think about her every day when I hear a child laugh over a story, when I see a tiny finger trace an illustration, when I watch a page turn and know that the right person is holding the book. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. If you believe that some stories are worth fighting for and that the best revenge is turning pain into purpose, hit like and subscribe. I'll be back with another turn of the page.